The key piece of today's slate in daily fantasy baseball is deciding how much stock you want to put in early season small samples. Because for most of the pitchers on the bump for today, we've got two starts already in the bag to dissect, analyze, and decide what kind of form they're in right now. That is a small sample, though. I am someone who is very okay with small samples, but even two starts is a little bit on the small end for me. So our job for today is to decide which of those small samples, whether good or bad, are legit, which ones we want to buy into, ones we want to actively work against, and decide how we want to play things for today in MLB DFS. Welcome on into the solo shot. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberfire.com. My name is Jim Saunis. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberfire.com, here to break down Wednesday's 10-game main slate. Lock for today is very early. It is at 6:07 p.m. Eastern. They had the A's and Orioles game moved up, and FanDuel had it on the slate already. So it starts at 6:07. They were going to have lock at 6:40, I believe, but now it will be 6:07 to keep that Orioles-A's game on the slate as well. So that's why it's a bit different of a schedule for today, but take note of that lock will be 6:07 p.m. Eastern for tonight. There is some weather on this slate starting off in Chicago at Wrigley Field. We got very high rain odds, the Cubs and the Rays. The game, I would say, is in danger of not being played, but the temperature is 50 degrees with winds out at 20 miles per hour. So low temperature, bad for hitting. Winds out at 20 at Wrigley, good for hitting. In net, I would think that this is a slight upgrade for hitters due to the wind, but it is just a slight upgrade with the temps being lower. So slight upgrade for bats, but keep in mind that game is, I would say, at risk of not playing. It is just 51 degrees in Detroit for the Tigers and the Yankees. Wind is also in from center at 12 miles per hour, so downgrade batters in that one. It is 58 degrees in D.C. for the Nats and the Diamondbacks, downgrade hitters there. Same thing in Boston for the Red Sox and Blue Jays, 50 degrees there, so a downgrade for batters. And finally, 56 degrees in New York for the Mets and Giants. Once again, downgrade batters in that game. We'll dive into the pitching preview for today in just 1 second, but first, a quick reminder to make sure you are subscribed to the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts. We, of course, are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, you name it, you can find us there. And if you like what you hear, leave us a rating and review as well. What that does by subscribing is you get this podcast in your inbox earlier to give yourself more time to research after the fact before the slate locks. You want to maximize that individual research time, deciding if you want to buy into what we said or not. So go to the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, hit subscribe, and maximize your chances at differentiating yourself from the field. The 2022 NBA playoffs are officially underway, and FanDuel and Mountain Dew have teamed up to add another layer of excitement to the first-round matchups. Introducing the Mountain Dew NBA Free Play, a daily fantasy basketball contest running every day until April 21st, until tomorrow, that is entirely free to enter. All you have to do is construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the designated salary cap and follow along as the games unfold to compete for your share of $3,000 in cash prizes. Plus, as an added bonus, if any of your lineups on the week have made the most three-pointers after Thursday night's games, you'll win an additional share of $3,000 in bonus cash and NBA swag. Tonight's games will be tipping off soon, so head to FanDuel.com/league/mountain-dew-playoffs to submit your lineup and get in on the action now. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. Pitching preview for this Wednesday main slate, Carlos Rodon is the highest salaried pitcher, checking in at $10,800. Chris Bassett is $10,500. Yes, Chris Bassett is $10,500. Logan Gilbert, $9,500. Merrill Kelly, $93,000. You can see why the discussion of early season hot starts is pertinent here. We got Sandy Alcantara at $9,200. Shohei Ohtani, $91,000. Luis Severino is $9,000. Miles Mikolas, Eric Fetty are the others at $8,000 or higher. So you can see here by looking at the salaries that the salaries have been very reactive to early starts this year because Bassett has been great. Merrill Kelly has been very good, and they've gotten shoved up the ladder. Carlos Rodon has been good too, but he's been good both this year and over a much larger sample. So if I've got a $300 gap between Rodon and Bassett, I'm going up $300 to get to Rodon every single time. He's actually in the same game as Bassett as they are facing the Mets on the road. And the Mets do have some good quality hitters. Rodon's playing across the country from San Francisco, but I'm still going to rank him first for tonight. He's just, I think, too good not to do so. We saw it again with Rodon in his most recent start. He faced Cleveland on the road, and he allowed just 2 hits over 7 innings with 9 strikeouts. That gets him 21 strikeouts in 2 starts this year. Now, in that game against Cleveland, Rodon didn't get as many whiffs as he did in his first game. But it kind of seemed like Cleveland, their approach to the plate was just trying to avoid getting deep in counts because Rodon can kill you there. And it led to a lot of weak contact. Swinging at bad pitches led to weak contact, and just 2 hits there. Still got 9 strikeouts because he's very good. That's also an indication of what Cleveland thinks of Rodon as a pitcher. It's respect, but they don't want to get in those 2 strike counts and get in a hole against him. Rodon did scale back a bit on his slider, but the usage was still very high. If we look at his 11 starts where he's used that slider more, going back to last year, he has a 35% strikeout rate. That is the highest on the slate in each guy's most relevant sample by 3 percentage points. Rodon is also allowing just a 35% hard hit rate in that time. So I think he's going to have a monster year. The Mets are a solid team again, a 110 WRC plus against lefties based on their current active roster since the start of last year. Just a 166 ISO. So even with there being a low strikeout team, I've got Rodon at 7.75 strikeouts projected for tonight. He is the only guy in the slate projected to have more than 7. So I think it's wise to ride with Rodon here. He's just the best guy in the slate, and I want to react appropriately. So Carlos Rodon, to me, the number 1 pitcher for tonight. Sandy Alcantara is also in a lower strikeout matchup facing the Cardinals, and they've got just a 20% strikeout rate against righties since the start of last year. But Alcantara, like Rodon, is really good. And it's not just for 2022 for Alcantara. In fact, 2022 has actually been a bit down for him in terms of DFS stuff. But I think overall, he is the better option for today behind just Rodon. We've seen Alcantara throwing a couple more sliders this year than he did last year. It's a 29% usage versus 24% last year. And that hasn't translated to a ton of whiffs yet. But I think it should, because we've seen Alcantara this year have a 38% whiff rate on that pitch, according to Baseball Savant. It was also 38% last year. So if he keeps leaning more on that slider, he should start to get strikeouts eventually. We've seen Alcantara throwing more sliders now for about 13 starts, and his strikeout rate overall in that time is 26%. He's at 19% this year, but it comes with an 11.8% swinging strike rate, which is closer to the 26% overall than it is in the 19% across 2 starts. So again, we should see Alcantara improve as the sample expands. Even without the strikeouts this year, the results have been good for Alcantara, and that's kind of the luxury you get with him. He typically has such a good batted ball profile that you have a cushion. Even when he's not all that sharp, the floor is still high. And then he can add on the ceiling when he's truly, truly on. I think it's totally fine to use him here, even on a pretty good slate. So with Alcantara, the early 2022 data in terms of strikeouts is not good, but I have reason to buy into the fact that it will get better as it goes along and make him a good play for today at $9,200 on today's slate. Now, the third slot depends on what you're looking for. If you want more of a salary saver, I think you can bump down to Eric Fetty at $8,300, and we'll talk about him and things to watch. But it's just $700 more to get to a value guy at $9,000, and that's Luis Severino. And I think I want Severino more than I want Fetty for just a $700 gap. Going into this year, I thought the Yankees might be pretty conservative with Severino in terms of pitch count, because coming off a long, extended injury, hasn't started much in the past 2.5 years. But last time out, Severino went 83 pitches. And to me, that means he can probably go 90 or so tonight. And 90 from Severino could be good enough to make him a really solid DFS play. Severino has looked good so far. He has a 12.8% swing and strike rate, getting some ground balls, and those came against the Red Sox and the Blue Jays. He gets the Tigers tonight, and they have a 97 WRC plus against righties with a 24% strikeout rate, which gives Severino a boost here. Plus, as mentioned in the top part, it is great weather for pitching for tonight, so I think everything lines up really well for Severino in this matchup. I've got him projected for 6.9 strikeouts. That's actually the second highest number on the slate behind just Rodon, but there's always a shot that he doesn't get a full leash, so I've got him projected for 90 pitches. I would not be shocked if he goes under that, which is why I would have Severino behind Alcantara too, despite the fact that I have Alcantara projected for fewer strikeouts. So I think Severino brings a lot to the table at $9,000. I'll go him number 3 with Rodon number 1, Alcantara number 2. We'll talk about Eric Fetty in things to watch. As far as stacking goes for today, the Angels are one of the teams that actually has a warm park for tonight. They also get a good matchup against a pitcher they just saw recently, so they check a lot of boxes here. So I will stack the Angels for today. They're facing Jake Odorizzi. Odorizzi was fine in the first matchup this year. He allowed 2 runs across 4 innings, and he's a guy who throws like 40 different pitches, so he might not suffer as much in a repeat matchup as some other pitchers might. But the profile for Odorizzi is one we can stack against for sure. The Angels didn't really get to him, but the Mariners did last week. They scored 4 runs and 4 1/3 innings. Odorizzi had just 3 walks to 1 strikeout. He's been leaning more on his four-seam fastball this year, which is something he started to do last year. And in 11 starts since he started doing that, Odorizzi's let up just 3 home runs. So that's a super impressive number. But it's also not sustainable because he has allowed a 44% fly ball rate in that time. His homer to fly ball ratio is 4.3%. Typically, this is a rough estimate, but like you expect things closer to 10%, probably a bit lower this year than usual. But you don't expect a 4.3% homer to fly ball rate over a large sample, which is where Odorizzi is right now. In other words, I'm expecting regression from where he has been both this year in the first 2 starts and towards the end of last year. And the Angels are a team that could very well bring that. So to me, I think the Angels are a team that grade out exceptionally well for tonight. Now, I'm not sure if Max Stassi will start because you never really know with a catcher, but I would use Stassi if he does. We know Stassi for hitting lefties. That's kind of like his archetype, I would say, in DFS, but he can bop righties too. He has a 214 ISO since the start of last year. So I think that Stassi's probably one of the better plays. Taylor Ward also has a low salary still. He's $2,400. And I think that if you use Ward, if you use Stassi, Anthony Rendon, $3,000 or so, I think that means we can stack the Angels without passing up Trout, Ohtani, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe not both in the same lineup with Rodon, but you can definitely at least try it for sure for today. Now, the weather in Boston is not ideal for stacking tonight. The temperatures are expected to be around 50 or so, but the Blue Jays are facing Nick Pivetta, and there may be enough hard contact for it not to matter too much. This is something that Pivetta struggled with last year, too. He had good plate discipline numbers, but he let up a 50% hard hit rate, which led to a 4.53 ERA. That was despite good plate discipline numbers. This year, the hard contact is still there. It's 71%. Now, that's a small sample. That's going to come down. It's not going to be 71% for the entire year, but the fact that it's very, very high tells you the batted ball issues he had last year are not gone. And the strikeouts are down a bit too. It's at 17% for Pivetta through 2 starts. His swinging strike rate is 9.6%. And those numbers for Pivetta are more similar to what he did in 2020 than 2021. That year, small sample again, but he had a 6.89 ERA. I don't think he'll be quite that bad this year. But there are some alarm bells going off here based on the reduced strikeout rates, the hard contact being very high. And I think the one thing we can count on here is the hard contact still being there regardless. That's going to be a given. But if Pivetta can't get strikeouts, he's going to get whacked around a bunch. And the early data suggests he is at least at risk of that. And I think that means we should be high in the Blue Jays for stacking here. This is a small sample in 2022. I will buy into because we've seen shades of it in the past. I think that the most impactful part, which is the hard contact, we expect to stick around. So in terms of judging guys based on small samples, I am more inclined to believe Pivetta's small sample than I may be for some other guys. As always with the Jays, it's key that the struggles for Pivetta do translate to righties and lefties. He let up a 44% fly ball rate to right-handed batters last year. The strikeout rate almost dead even between righties and lefties. So don't worry too much about this being a righty-heavy lineup. I think you can just stack the Jays here and hope that those hard-hit balls wind up falling in. Moving on to our third stack. Last week, Daniel Lynch did some really good stuff. He got 7 strikeouts in 5 innings, and that's kind of in line with what he did in the lower minors. Got a ton of swinging strikes down in the lower minors, and you kind of like, okay, it gets your attention when a guy like that gets 7 strikeouts. But the hard contact was still there, and I think that allows us to stack the Twins for today. 67 degrees of temperature in Kansas City, so a bit better than a lot of spots on this slate. That game last week for Lynch was against the Cardinals. In addition to the 7 strikeouts, he also let up 3 home runs. Of the 17 balls in play, 11 against Lynch were hard hit, which is a very high number. 65% fly ball rate in that time as well. So the strikeouts for Lynch were very good. It does increase the risk of the stack because strikeouts reduce sample on balls in play. Can't get a hit on a strikeout. So you want the lowest number of strikeouts possible in an ideal world. We're not going to get that with Lynch. I'd expect the strikeouts to be here. But that's a lot of dangerous contact to allow. And it was an issue for Lynch last year, too. We're up to an 11 start sample on Lynch using more sliders. His hard hit rate allowed is 46% with a 43% fly ball rate. Typically getting numbers above 40 in both departments is hard. We're there with Lynch. And there's no real signs that's stopping anytime soon. So the Twins may not be the best team against lefties. That's especially true if Byron Buxton sits another day. But with the temperature in this game being higher than other places and Lynch letting up a lot of hard contact, I do think we want to give the Twins a ride in this spot. One twin gets a pretty big bump up against lefties is Jorge Polanco. He's good against righties too. But his ISO against lefties since the start of last year is 218. He has a 45% fly ball rate. And he rarely strikes out. So he's one guy. Other guy is Gary Sanchez. And Sanchez is someone who I think is more dependent on the righty-lefty split because the strikeout rate, as we know, can be a little dicey against righties. But against lefties, it goes down to 25%. He's $2,700. I think that Sanchez is someone we can turn to for here. 270 ISO. I think that they've got some boppers here, even if Buxton can't go. Carlos Correa's salary is pretty low. He's been struggling to start the year, but would be okay going there too. So the Twins, to me, the number 3 stack of the day. Things to watch for this slate. I mentioned at the top that I don't mind Eric Fetty. Part of that is the matchup here based on the Diamondbacks, but he's also throwing a lot of sliders or cutters this year, depending on where you look for your classifications. And that's a good strikeout pitch for him because if we look at the times where Fetty has thrown that wipeout pitch more often, got a 25% strikeout rate in 11 outings. So I think he's super interesting. I am going to probably have him in my player pool if I had to guess. And you look at the Diamondbacks, they're a very lefty-heavy team. I don't think that bothers me for Fetty because he uses that cutter or slider against lefties. So I think that he's better positioned to attack them than others may be. And that makes me feel pretty okay with him for today. The Yankees are facing Eduardo Rodriguez, and it's a really awful start for him so far where he's had really bad results paired with bad peripherals. And he doesn't seem too different than he was last year, which is why, the velocity is pretty similar, stuff like that, pitch mix. That's why I'm more optimistic that Eduardo Rodriguez bounces back than I am guys like Pivetta and others. So here's a small sample where I'm not totally buying in. It's noteworthy to me, and I'm okay stacking the Yankees under the assumption that struggles do continue. That's why the Yankees are 4th for me. But the fact that I'm skeptical of the small sample continues is why the Yankees are 4th rather than being, 2nd or 3rd, stuff like that. So Yankees are on my list for sure, but not all that high as a result of the fact I think Rodriguez will bounce back. Finally, if you want one more stacking option, I'd be okay with the Orioles in that moved up game against Dalton Jeffries. Jeffries so far has escaped issues, but he still projects as a low strikeout guy. Not the best at suppressing hard contact either. So I think these things will bite him eventually. The Orioles are not the best offense, but they're also not the worst. So I'm okay with considering them here and going with the Orioles at times within my stacks. And again, make sure you remember that game locks or starts at 6:07. So lock is 6:07 for tonight as well. Let's finish up with our dinger calls for this Wednesday slate. For the boring one, I'm going to go as boring as possible. The reigning AL MVP, Shohei Ohtani, facing Jake Odorizzi. Odorizzi does not have the same reverse platoon splits he used to have, so going with the lefty against him, totally okay in my books. I think Shohei Ohtani goes deep for tonight. The number 2-1 is Zach Collins, and Collins is a catcher, so like Omar Narvaez yesterday, might not wind up being in the order, but Collins always, even when he was coming out in the draft, had this really good eye at the plate. And you were kind of questioning whether that eye at the plate would eventually translate to power, to home runs. It has a bit this year, and there were some signs of him being a viable DFS play last year too. So the official home run calls for today, Shohei Ohtani and Zach Collins. That is all that we have here for today on the Solo Shot. But again, a reminder to make sure you are subscribed to the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts. We've got MLB, NHL, UFC, PGA, not for this week, but there's a classic going on, and NASCAR as well, all in the same place. So search for the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, hit subscribe. If you like what you hear, leave us a rating and review. If you've got any questions for me, I am on Twitter at Jim Sannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Big thank you to everyone for tuning in for today. Good luck to you with your DFS lineups. We'll talk to you once again on Thursday to get you set for another slate. This has been the solo shot right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.